Hey everyone, welcome back and thank you for being here. This is part six of the lecture series on Jean-Paul Sartre's Sketch Sphere Theory of the Motions. It should also be the last episode. Um, and I kind of want to jump into it and just, we don't have that much left. Um, and we also only have like two beat shifts. We're on page 52 and this section ends on page 61. So we have literally 10 pages, and then the 3 pages from the conclusion. So 13 pages is not going to take 90 minutes. It'll probably take about 45 minutes. Um, and I'm going to start by rereading the paragraph we closed with. I closed with it so that you kind of know where we're going and wrap up what we had just covered. Um, there was a lot so far in section three. Um, discussion of thetic, non-thetic, positional, non-positional, reflective and non-reflective consciousnesses. Um, a lot of consideration about the different kinds of world, the different kinds of attitude, hodologies of um, what we could do. I was playing chess while the video was processing, and I was thinking of hodology in that sense too. Um, Sartre's example is that pin game where you move the pin around the board and you have to avoid the holes, and that's the deterministic world, which is difficult. And the means in reasoning is the hodologies. But you can also think of it as this the set of the horizon of possibilities. That's more of what phenomenology calls it. And so, like, while I was waiting for my opponent to make their move, who's a friend, and I was waiting for them to make their move, and I realized, like, when I play mobily, I just kind of leave immediately, and I don't look at like the other. I don't look at the board. I don't analyze the board to see what the possible moves that I could make or what I want to do or what my goals might be are. And that's not just in chess, that's for life too, or that's for any kind of thing that we package away instead of dedicating the time to reflect on the space before us and what could become. Um, and so I, but like versus playing with a friend in person, I used to have a friend in Houston who I'd love to go to Cocoa Crepes and Waffles. He was a violin student at Rice, a good guy. Um, and we had a lot of fun. And he always beat me, always beat me. Um, haven't talked to him in a long time because I didn't live up to his standards as a friend. He didn't trust me for some reason. So I learned from that. That was like, gosh, that had to be over 4 years ago now, and I miss him. I lost a couple other friends in that year. Um, anyway, hodology, right? We're playing chess in person while he's thinking about his move. Um, I'm there, like, looking at the board and seeing what else I can do, because what else are you going to do while you're sitting there playing? You're fully present with the person. And that's what any chess player does too. Um, and it's probably non-reflective. Certainly non-reflective. I mean, there's nothing self-aware about looking at a chessboard. The consciousness is not that positioned on itself. It's only reflective in the non-positional mode of consciousness, where insofar as my consciousness is out there in the world, um, insofar as our consciousness is shared out here in the world. So yeah, those are some of the things. I mean, it was a crazy, um, I just, phenomenology always feels so magical. It feels like, and rigorous too. It has these really cool ideas, and yet it goes way off into the deep end about claims that really kind of make sense. Um, what else? So upcoming in this episode, we're gonna do, we're gonna look at the way that emotion is believed, even though it is something we are responsible for, it is still non-reflective. And even though non-reflective is not unconscious, it is fully believed, and it's not something we can. It's not play acting. It's not what an actor does. I mean, we actually undergo the emotion and then have to respond to the new world the best we can. But again, by emphasizing that it's our spontaneous emotion, it's our freedom exerting itself in the face of unfreedom. Um, Let me make sure this looks right. Yeah, that looks right. Um, our freedom asserting itself as a way of changing the body because we can't change the world is what Sartre talks about. So I don't exactly know what all else we'll cover, but I know that we'll talk about horror and wonder. Um, he's really gonna, we talked about Abschätzungen too. He's really gonna talk about, I'm kind of repeating myself with how I'm saying these things. Um, it's weird when you notice your own patterns. First, he presents two caveats about how emotion overtakes us. Emotion is undergone. Real emotion is undergone. We talked for a long time about real emotion. Real emotion is quite another matter. It is accompanied by belief. That paragraph is almost 3 pages long. It takes up the entirety of 51 and 52. Um, oh no, so there's another beat shift at the bottom of 50. I didn't see that. I have so many annotations I can't see. So right here. Yes, we talked about the dual nature of the body. Okay, so going from the dual nature of the body into sorry, my head was like completely in it earlier, and now I'm like spent. But I think that as long as you've watched the other 5 episodes, this will make sense to you now. And so I just want to read it and get through the text. Um, and I'm sure I'll learn more too. I don't know everything all the time, and I can always learn something new. He's going to talk about the two different worlds, the magical world, the breakdown of the deterministic world. We've already prefaced that at the very beginning, but it's more so given here. Specifically, so from page 52 to 53 is basically the discussion of those two caveats that the origin of emotion is a spontaneous debasement lived by consciousness in face of the deterministic world that it cannot um, overcome. And so it seizes new relationships between itself and the world, and therefore it seizes a new world, a magical world with a new emotion that is more tenable with less tension. Um, and he'll give that two caveats and explain more about the kind of dynamism. Remember, this is also the dual nature of the body as an object and as lived by consciousness speaks again to the object in the third person and the lived by consciousness in the first person. And there's a simultaneity of that that mirrors the simultaneity of unity and multiplicity, self-other, um, knower known, perceiver world. Um, okay. And then there's a long nevertheless, which shows that this spontaneous debasement lived by consciousness in face of the world. First, it's not thetic of itself, except it has only a positional consciousness, and it's still non-thetic consciousness, a conscious of itself. And secondly, it's captive, and then um, nevertheless, emotion evokes the appearance of a world. And what kind of world is that? Well, the truly magical world, once the sort of all those strict rules that we assume, the things we assume have to be true, those break down at some point in certain like near-death experiences, religious experiences. Um, and when they do, we get the magical world. He's trying to lead us into that, although I couldn't quite the appearance of a world and then subtle emotions. Remember too that a change in intention causes us to perceive a different interpretation upon the same hyle or the same matter, right? We have the intention of looking for a gun in a picture puzzle, and so we take the hyle or the oplenum noise matter of oplenum is like, just means full, no blank spaces. Um, we take that of like the tree diagram, and then we are looking, trying to form the insight of perceiving the gun, and eventually we do locate it, but we locate it through a process of looking for it intentionally. And that intentionality is also present as emotional. There's a lot of intentions that are non-reflective, or more specifically, that are non-thetic, because those non-thetic intentions form the whole affective persona. So then he'll talk about horror and wonder. Um, at one point he says the magical is the mind crawling among things, and man is always a sorcerer to man, and the social world is primarily magical. Here, hold on, I need to fix my posture. All right, that seems better. And yeah, he talks about when he talks about horror and wonder, what he comes to is that he says the sudden passage from a rational apprehension of the world to an apprehension of the same world as magical, when this is motivated by the object itself, um, and accompanied by a disagreeable element, that is horror. But if it is accompanied by an agreeable element, it will be admiration or wonder. He doesn't say wonder here. We mentioned these two examples, but there are naturally many other cases. Thus, there are two forms of emotion according to whether it is we who constitute the magic of the world to replace a deterministic activity which cannot be realized, or the other form of emotion, whether the world itself is unrealizable and reveals itself suddenly as a magical environment. Um, Unrealizable, not just because of our specific exigences and the consequences, the contradictions between our demands and urges and needs. Not urges, sorry, urgent demands and needs drawn from the environment, whereas urges would be something internal to us. Um, Exigences do urge us. Anyway, the example he gives for horror and wonder is a face at the window who might be a threat, and we don't think about the deterministic features um, of horror and wonder. And in those instances, the world itself seems to be magical. So that horror and wonder section, it goes into the deterministic world. It goes into two types of like utilizable or instrumental world versus felt or emotional world. And it just kind of trails off from there. As far as I can tell, there might be another beat shift in here that somebody else can make more precisely, but this is good enough for our purposes. Um, and then in the conclusion, he goes back to talking about like meta phenomenological or uh, metadisciplinary considerations. So how to reconcile different disciplines. So kind of leaving the conversation, we're done with the sketch, and going back to the critique of psychology and what it would mean for psychology to relate to phenomenology. Uh, Vaguely, that's what I vaguely remember from it. So yeah, let's jump into the first part. It's that origin of emotion is a spontaneous debasement with the two caveats. Oh, and I guess you could go at least to the notes. I have some notes, and we could go at least to, well, one, we could read the notes from the pages we've already read, that we ended with last time, and I think they'll really trail us in nicely. And then we can, from here, go to the notes on page 55. So the guiding question for this whole section, for section 3, outline of a phenomenological theory, how does emotion as a transformation of the world, but you have to understand what world is and why it's a transformation and why it's a function of perception, imply and provide evidence for the reality of the magical world, i.e., for the world as fundamentally magical. On page 49, there was a continued, I guess some of these notes were on the previous page or whatever, but real emotion is accompanied by belief. Qualities are taken to be real. Physiological symptoms, psychic phenomena, and behavior combine. The psychic phenomena being the state of consciousness, combined in one whole synthetic form. A disordered body carrying on a certain kind of behavior. Emotion is a phenomenon of belief. Page 50 to 51. Consciousness lives the new affective transformation directly, commits itself to it. That presence to itself, a lot of these are direct quotes from Sartre. The body considered as the point of view upon the universe immediately inherent in consciousness. These should sound familiar because we read these already together in this in the last episode. Not these notes, but the parts that were verbatim from him. We read that text, these pages. A non-thetic consciousness of itself remains, spontaneous debasement lived by consciousness in face of the world. And then these are the new notes. So we'll go really just this first half page. Emotion is captivating and delusional / hysterical, captive to itself. It is the essence of consciousness to transcend itself, and it is therefore impossible for it to withdraw within itself and to doubt whether it is outside in the object. It knows itself only in the world. Quote, the magical world appears, takes form, and then closes. That's a typo. It has too many ESs. Closes in on the consciousness and clutches it. The objects are themselves captivating, passing over to the infinite, adumbrating, and I forget the German word, Abschätzungen, I think. Yeah, Abschätzungen, the adumbration, passing over to the infinite. Emotion is an intuition of the absolute. He explicitly says that. I wonder if I think we already covered where he says empirical intuition, and he's also talked about the pragmatic intuition of the deterministic world. So he takes, despite being in phenomenology, he's really synthesizing with a lot of traditions. Okay, so this is Sartre's words verbatim. We're on page 52. Thus, the origin of emotion, and this is the first full paragraph. Thus, the origin of emotion is a spontaneous debasement lived by consciousness in face of the world. What it is unable to endure in one way, it tries to seize in another way, by going to sleep, by reducing itself to the states of consciousness in sleep, dream, or hysteria. And the bodily disturbance is nothing else than the belief, lived by the consciousness, as it is seen from outside, only it must be noted. First, that the consciousness has no thetic consciousness of self as abasing itself to escape the pressures of the world. It's not focused on that. It has only a positional consciousness of the degradation of the world, which is passed over to the magical plane. Still, a non-thetic consciousness of itself remains. It is to the degree that it does so, and to that degree only that we can say of an emotion that it is not sincere. So this sort of feeling of our full self being non-thetically present to us, or adumbrated or Abschätzungen on the given, but partially and in a dialectic of unfolding, um, is also why emotions seem to be a sort of bad faith or inauthenticity or dishonesty to self for Sartre, because they estrange us from the full potential of what we failed to be, I think. It is not at all surprising, therefore, that the final aim of an emotion is not posited by an act of consciousness in the midst of the emotion itself. Its finality is not, for all that, unconscious, but it is used up in the constituting of the object. His idea about emotions being in bad faith, though, I mean, I think there could be like a Jamesian pragmatism to um, a positive belief that things will work out that gives you energy and fortitude to keep trying. Versus like Mitsumi says, you don't need that kind of thing. That's like problematic. What you need is to have a sort of different kind of hope. That also may have been Duncan Trussell from the Midnight Gospel. Just give up hope. I forget exactly how Mitsumi talks about hope. Also right here, so why not? A body doesn't coincide with itself. It's not present to itself. This is Brian Mitsumi. It is already on the move to a next at the same time as it is doubling over on itself, bringing its past up to date in the present through memory, habit, reflex, and so on. So they are kind of the affective field, imminent affect does kind of posit this sort of, yeah, like the prehensions behind the apprehension of the world. But I think that's appropriate. I think that's fair. Sorry, just looking for Matsumi says emotion is the way the depth of that ongoing experience registers personally at a given moment. Zernazi, emotion then is only a limited expression of the depth of our experience. I want to see where hope is. So how do your ideas on affect and hope come together here? That's from Zernazi. In my own work, I use the concept of affect as a way of talking about that margin of maneuverability, the hodological space, the where we might be able to go and what we might be able to do in every present situation. So we could say that a positive emotion or a positive belief, but we have to bring ourselves to a state of actually believing it is the issue. And simply saying you're entitled to believe this is usually not enough to give us the will to try. The will is therefore an important has to be a possible thing. And Sartre doesn't deny the will. So some emotions, it seems, can motivate or invigorate the will in a way that is not bad faith. And that's very nuanced. Um, I think hope was the hodological. I guess affect is the word I use for hope. One of the reasons is it's such an important concept for me is because it explains why focusing on the next experimental step rather than the big utopian picture isn't really settling for less. It's not exactly going for more either. It's more like being right where you are more intensely. Um, By affect, I don't mean emotion in the everyday sense. The way I use it comes primarily from Spinoza. He talks to the body in terms of its capacity for affecting or being affected. These are not two different capacities. They always go together. When you affect something, you're at the same time opening yourself up to being affected in turn and in a slightly different way than you might have been the moment before. You have made a transition, however slight. There's always a transformation of the world in affect. It's a fun little thesis to throw in there with a cross-reference. Okay. Um, Still not sincere. It is not surprising, therefore, that the final aim of an emotion is not posited by an act of consciousness in the midst of the emotion itself. Its finality is not for all that unconscious, but it is used up in the constituting of the object. I think we already read that, so I'm going to keep going. Hmm. Secondly, that the consciousness is caught in its own snare, precisely because it is living in the new aspect of the world by believing in it. The consciousness is captured by its own belief, exactly as it is in dreams and hysteria. Oh, I forgot to tell y'all. I had a dream last night that they made a movie about this book, and um, I was like, oh crap, they cast a man as Dembo because the translation is wrong. So, but obviously that makes no sense, and it was clearly a dream. Um, but I remember like seeing Dembo, and I was like, that's wrong. I was too late to fix this. I didn't alert the copyright, the publisher soon enough. I didn't have those words, but it was like the impression that overcomes you in a dream. Anyway, The consciousness of the emotion is captive, but by this it must not be understood to be fed. Because remember, the translator in the last episode we read that the translator put T Dembo, but he does not take it for something like that. He does not realize, but it's actually Tamra, Tamra Dembo, Russian-born American psychologist, co-founder of field theory with Kurt Lewin. The consciousness of the emotion is captive, but by this it must not be understood to be fettered by anything whatever outside itself. It is captive to itself in this sense, that it does not dominate the belief that it is doing its utmost to live. And this precisely because it is living that belief and is absorbed in living it. It must not be imagined that consciousness is spontaneous in the sense that it is always free to deny a thing and to affirm it at one and the same moment. Such a spontaneity would be self-contradictory. It is of the essence of consciousness to transcend itself, and it is therefore impossible for it to withdraw within itself and to doubt whether it is outside in the object. It knows itself only in the world, and doubt of its very nature can be nothing but the constitution of an existential quality of the object. The doubtful, or the reflective activity of reduction, that is, the property of a new consciousness directed towards the positional consciousness. Um, when I'm conscious of an object, I have the positional consciousness of that, and then I think about that, and I think that's what he means. Thus, when consciousness is living the magical world into which it has precipitated itself, it tends to perpetuate that world by which it is captivated. The emotion tends to perpetuate itself. It is in this sense that we may say it is undergone. The consciousness is moved by its emotion and heightens it. The faster one flees, the more one is afraid. Winchester. The magical world appears, takes form, and then closes in on the consciousness and clutches it. It cannot even wish to escape it. It may seek to flee from the magical object, but to flee from it is to give it more magical reality than ever. And this very condition of captivity is not in itself realized by the consciousness, which attributes it to the objects. It is they that are captivating, imprisoning it. They have taken it, the objects have taken possession of the consciousness. Liberation can come only from a purifying reflection or from the total disappearance of the emotional situation. A purifying reflection might be like that new transformation of emotion. Um, Nevertheless, and so that's another beat shift. Nevertheless, and for all that, emotion would not be so all-absorbing if it apprehended in the object no more than the exact counterpart of what it is noetically. For instance, at this present time, in this light, in such or such circumstances, this man is terrifying. But it is constitutive of emotion that it attributes to the object something that infinitely transcends it. Indeed, there is a world of emotion. So when we have an emotion, we attribute something to the object. The exact counterpart of what it is noetically, right? So it's not just like my mind experiences whatever the thing is. Absolutely. I mean, there is a hermeneutic component, first of all. It depends on the perspective and the history, the physical perspective, as well as the historical, affective, psychological perspective, the interpretive perspective, what your mind does with it once it's received from that perspective. I mean, it just immediately snowballs into different interpretations. Um, but it is constitutive of the object of emotion that it attributes to the object something that infinitely transcends it. And somehow this is, so he's kind of desubjectivated the process of still being responsible for your emotions. Um, but we can maybe keep the responsibility by actually desubjectivating and seeing ourselves out there in the world and thinking of the self as more of something spread out and diffuse. Um, And here he transfers into talking about worlds specifically. We already kind of talked about the deterministic world being too difficult, but here is really the shift from the deterministic world to the magical world. Indeed, there is a world of emotion. All emotions have this in common, that they evoke the appearance of a world, cruel, terrible, bleak, joyful, etc., but in which the relations of things to consciousness are always and exclusively magical. So there's an immediacy in the magical world. There are no means. There's just like right up against thrownness onto the phenomena. It's really intense. Um, and every time we have an emotion, it reveals that the world itself is the kind of place that can house or exhibit or bring forth that emotion. So when we have a horrible feeling, we realize that the world itself is in certain aspects horrible. That's what he'll say further down. We have to speak of a world of emotion as one speaks of a world of dreams or of worlds of madness. A world, that means individual syntheses in mutual relations and possessing qualities. Other philosophers have very different definitions of a world. Um, I'm actually kind of putting together um, some thinking about like archaic worlding, how ethics and justice and the justice of the soul impacts. Really, I think Sartre's being ethics would be great for this because it's like when you're in bad faith, you have to reduce your consciousness. But Emerson talks about this too in Acquaint Thyself Firsthand with Deity. And Lugones talks about it in a political register about folding away the people that we take advantage of because we don't want to have to think about our guilt in relation to them. So I call it archaic worlding, but I've got pretty decent handful of it's like a parallel project kind of separate from my quote unquote metaphysical work on affect theory. Um, like Deleuze, um, like his text on Leibniz with the fold and folding and unfolding. I think that would be fruitful there. And and Emerson and Dewey too. Because you have aesthetic consummation to the extent that you're able to grow and bring forth those consummate perceptions. And maybe something from Gloria Anzaldúa on attenuation of the world, which means like making yourself of a certain way that you can hold space for the entire world. But Lugones's concept of world is very different from this. It is way more flexible. It's always lived. People inhabit multiple worlds. Um, but phenomenologists tend to create the world as something ontological instead of as something that is always private and personal and can only be shared through an immediate contact or exposure with the other, which is more like what Nancy will say. So Nancy could be really helpful um, with this as well. It could be good enough for a dissertation. So a world. That means individual syntheses in mutual relations and possessing qualities. But no quality is conferred upon an object without passing over to the infinite. This gray, for instance, represents the units of an infinity of real and possible Abschattungen, some of which will be gray-green, some gray seen in a certain light, black, etc. Similarly, the qualities that emotion confers upon the object and upon the world, it confers upon them ad aeternum. True, when I suddenly conceive an object to be horrible, I do not explicitly affirm that it will remain horrible for eternity, but the mere affirmation of horribleness as a substantial quality, the object is already in itself a passage to the infinite, right? That's what he means by this is a passage to the infinite. It's that every new experience, every transformation of the world, adumbrates and attenuates a wider understanding of what the world is capable of. And quite frankly, we want to be as good of people as possible so that we don't um, create a worse world where we are not only aware of it, but maybe where it's actually not just the awareness of it being there, but maybe we don't want to transform it into a more selfish world or a more stingy world or a world that can break down at any moment or a what's the word? Um, it's like whenever it happens too quickly, it's too volatile. It's not volatile is not the word. Um, I want to try to just remember it, but I because I don't like looking these things up. But I don't want to sit on camera like doing that. Um, it's in Dewey. Dewey uses it to talk about. It's not fickle. It's a good word to remember. I just and mercurial is a good word, but it's not mercurial. Protean is also a good word. Capricious, caprice. So unless the world is Dewey talks about a world which is too capricious to allow understanding to happen or to integrate the different pieces. And likewise, in a world that is in which the actor or the agent is doing horrible things, they are more likely, and this is the Ring of Gyges basically, um, and why you won't have a justice of the soul if you start to perceive that the world is possible, is capable of those things. Um, the better of a person you are, the more you live life thinking that I genuinely think that, and I also think that I mean, I've had bad things happen to me, but they usually happen after I've done something that I realized was bad. Um, and I'm not sure if it was my bad action or the bad thing that happened. Sometimes it wasn't even an act. It was like I had my car broken into once, but I had um hurt a close loved one just right before it happened. And I didn't think they were the person who broke into my car, but I felt like there was some kind of divine synchronicity between deserving that to happen to me. I call that karma. Karma is your self-belief about what you deserve. So we can have a phenomenology of karma right here. Um, because what happens is that when you act a certain way, the world around you seems that certain way. So this is my interpretation of like when you are reborn into a different life or world in Buddhism. It's because you've closed one chapter and opened another chapter where you've transformed your self-consciousness into being either more worthy or less worthy based on how you view yourself, because you can never avoid accruing knowledge of your actions, whether you're reflective about it or not. Okay. In itself, a passage to the infinite. The horrible is now in the thing, at the heart of it, is its emotive texture, is constitutive of it. Thus, during emotion, an overwhelming and definitive quality of the thing makes its appearance. And that is what transcends and maintains our emotion. Horribleness is not only the present state of the thing, it is a menace for the future. It extends over and darkens the whole future. It is a revelation about the meaning of the world. The horrible means, indeed, that horribleness is a substantial quality, that there is horribleness in the world. Thus, in every emotion, a multitude of affective pretensions extends into the future and presents it in an emotional light. I think I've forgotten to explain this in most of my classes when I read it, but a protension, there's retending and protending in phenomenology, and a retention is how the past carries into the present, and the protension is how the present opens onto the future. Um, we are living emotively a quality that penetrates into us, that we are suffering, and that surrounds us in every direction. Immediately, the emotion is lifted out of itself and transcends itself. It is no ordinary episode of our daily life, but an intuition of the absolute. And Dewey would call it an experience, probably anesthetic experience, but for Sartre, it's an intuition of the absolute. It is lifted out of itself and transcends itself, passes over to the infinite, and transforms the world's affective capabilities as well as ours by changing, by presenting a felt emotional phenomena that is yet still spontaneous and agent-oriented and owned, and which for which we are responsible. It is this that explains the subtle emotions. In these, by means of a hardly noticeable behavior, through a slight oscillation of our physical condition, we apprehend an objective quality of the object. Through a slight oscillation of our physical condition, I'm kind of like, this sounds like that corticothalamic sensitivity you talked about earlier, buddy. But I'm gonna trust him on it. Um, Maybe the slight oscillation, right, is something that we are reflective of, or are at least that can become thetic of. Not maybe not reflective, but can become thetic of. Um, and through that we apprehend an objective quality of the object. Subtle emotion is not at all afraid of the slightly unpleasant, of a diminished excellence, or of what is superficially disastrous, like the mixtures. For it only glimpses the unpleasant, the excellent, or the disastrous through a veil. It is a dim intuition and presents itself as such. But the object is there, waiting, and tomorrow perhaps the veil will be withdrawn, and we shall see it in full daylight. Therefore, one may be very little moved, if by moved we understand all those disturbances of the body or the behavior, and still apprehend our whole life as disastrous. The disaster is total. We know it. It is profound. But for the present, we have only a glimpse of it. In this case, and in many others like it, the emotion seems to be much stronger than it really is. Since, in spite of all, we sense a profound disaster through it. These subtle emotions are naturally, tangentially, different from the merely weak emotions, which invest the object with no more than a faintly affective character. So subtle emotions are still strong emotions, but they're not just like faintly, they're not like dim emotions, but the nature of them is dim. It is the intention that differentiates subtle from weak emotion. For the behavior and the somatic condition may be identical in both cases, but the intention is, in its turn, motivated by the situation. Strong intention versus weak intention, maybe. It might be worth you know, that could be a topic of trying to understand what that is. You could write a paper trying to parse that. This theory of emotion does not explain the immediate reactions. Okay, so this is the next beat shift. And here we're going to talk about horror and wonder as a sudden thrownness into a different world. Um, and we're leaving the deterministic world of means and reasoning and causal relations and moving into the psychological, social, emotional world, into a magical world. Sometimes it is this world that reveals itself to consciousness as magical. It's not an ephemeral quality that we impose upon the world. There is an existential structure of the world that is magical. Magic is consciousness rendered passive. These are all quotes. Magic is the mind crawling among things, an irrational synthesis of spontaneity and passivity. Man is always a sorcerer to man, and the social world is primarily magical, plunged back again into the original magic, tempting consciousness to live it. Horror and the sudden passage from a rational apprehension of the world to an apprehension of the same world as magical when that is motivated by the object itself and is accompanied by a disagreeable element, and if agreeable, it's wonder. These notes are wrong. I don't think this is the dyad. I don't think the dyad maps onto horror wonder. But there is a dyad right after it. Objects unite with our conscious perception uh, to hold captive and determine our activity, make up a synthetic whole together with the upheaval in our own organism. Magic extends to things also, retains the traces, bear the imprint. The consciousness which is realizing the spontaneous finality and magical aspect of the world may create the opportunity to manifest itself as a real magic quality, diffusing the magic everywhere or concentrating it forcibly upon a single object. Emotion is the magical transformation of the world. And that's on page 58, experiencing anything requires a background. Emotion arises when the world of the utilizable vanishes abruptly, the deterministic world, and the world of magic appears in its place. In its place as a transformation of the world. And you go back to the Gestalt psychologist argument, the breakdown of the deterministic world is given back there. And because there has to be some kind of fluidity into the new emotion or the new world, the magical world, um, it is a reorganization of what was already there, but it also transforms and develops it in some way. I Jean-Luc Nancy has this phrase where he talks about one equals one plus one, which is a way of trying to understand unity multiplicity, but also of trying to understand how matter transforms without like with the conservation of mass and energy. Emotion is the return of consciousness to the magical attitude with the appearance of the correlative world, the magical world. Emotion is not an accident, it is a mode of our conscious existence, one of the ways in which consciousness understands its being in the world. Emotion is not a pure, ineffable quality. It has a meaning, it signifies something. Emotion at work, constituting the magical form of the world. And we'll do the conclusion after you're finished reading. Okay, page 55, bottom paragraph. This theory of emotion does not explain the immediate reactions of horror and wonder that sometimes possess us when certain objects suddenly appear to us. For example, a grimacing face suddenly appears pressed against the outside of the window. I am frozen with terror. Here, of course, there is no appropriate behavior, and it would seem that the emotion has no finality. Moreover, in a general way, our apprehension of the horrible in situations or faces is more or less immediate and is not usually manifested by flight or by fainting. One is not even tempted to flee. Nevertheless, upon closer consideration, these very peculiar phenomena are susceptible of an explanation compatible with the ideas we have been discussing. We have seen how, during an emotion, so the two peculiar phenomena are horror and wonder. During an emotion, the consciousness abases itself and abruptly transmutes the determinist world in which we live into a magical world. But conversely, sometimes it is this world that reveals itself to consciousness as magical, just where we expect it to be deterministic. It must not indeed be supposed that magic is an ephemeral quality that we impose upon the world, according to our humor. There is an existential structure of the world which is magical. We will not now enlarge upon this subject, which we are reserving for treatment elsewhere, probably being a nothingness. However, we are able here and now to point out that the category of magic governs the inter-psychic relations between men and society. Inter meaning between, different, separate things. So there's some element of transcendence involved in that definition. Um, versus intra-psychic, which would be like internal to just my consciousness or just your consciousness, the states of consciousness. An intrapsychic relation would be like the intrastructural bonds of the transformation of consciousness that we just discussed, going from the deterministic world to the magical world. But the magical world is also interpsychic, not just an intrapsychic transformation. Interpsychic relations between men and society, and more precisely, our perception of others. The magical, as Elaine says, is the mind crawling among things. That is an irrational synthesis of spontaneity and passivity. It is an inert activity, a consciousness rendered passive. But it is precisely in that form that others appear to us, and this not because of our position in relation to them, nor in consequence of our passions, but by essential necessity. Indeed, consciousness can only be a transcendent object by undergoing the modification of passivity. Thus, the meaning of a face, it's kind of, those are two dense sentences. Those are two dense sentences. A consciousness rendered passive. So we take the other that we see for an object, basically, because we don't have access to the active synthesis that they're undergoing. And this not because of our position in relation to them, nor in consequence of our passions, but by essential necessity, just from the difference of personhood. Indeed, consciousness can only be a transcendent object, something we can do phenomenology on by undergoing the modification of passivity. So this is again another way of thinking about the first and third person, the active and the passive, the mind or the consciousness and the body, or the lived body and the body as object, the consciousness and the world. Um, and this is not to say that the world cannot be immanent or make itself, but it does so in relation with us and in an open-ended intentionality structure, both directions, bidirectionally, of mutual um, some common hyle or base or ontological substance for phenomenological mind matter consciousness that is simultaneously both. We will return to these remarks later when we hope to show that they impose themselves upon the mind. It follows, um, sorry, no, by undergoing the modification of passivity. Thus, the meaning of a face is, first of all, that of the consciousness, not a sign of the consciousness, but of a consciousness that is altered, degraded, which precisely is passivity. So it's like the surface of something that has a depth that we can't access. There's some givenness to it, but not in the way that other things are given to us from our own psychological access, psychic access, phenomenological access, etc. We will return to these remarks later when we hope to show that they impose themselves upon the mind. It follows that man is always a sorcerer to man, and the social world is primarily magical. Not that it is impossible to take a deterministic view of the interpsychological world, or to build rational superstructures upon it, but then it is those structures that are ephemeral and unstable. It is they that crumble away as soon as the magical aspect of faces, gestures, and human situations becomes too vivid. And what happens then when the superstructures, laboriously built up by the reason, disintegrate, and man finds himself suddenly plunged back again into the original magic? That is easily predicted. The consciousness seizes upon the magic as magic and lives it vividly as such. The categories suspicious and disquieting, etc., designate the magical insofar as it is being lived by consciousness, or insofar as it is tempting consciousness to live it. The sudden passage from a rational apprehension of the world to an apprehension of the same world as magical, when this is motivated by the object itself and accompanied by a disagreeable element, that is horror. If it is accompanied by an agreeable element, it will be admiration. We mention these two examples, but there are naturally many other cases. Thus, there are two forms of emotion, not horror and admiration. Um, According to whether it is we who constitute the magic of the world, to replace a deterministic activity which cannot be realized, or whether the world itself is unrealizable and reveals itself suddenly as a magical environment. And this is kind of the answer to the guiding question, but Sartre has to like take us through the emotional phenomenological route to show us that emotion reveals the magical world, um, to finally open us up to the possibility that the world could be magical in and of itself. And we could be superimposing those superstructures of reason, um, and interpretation on top of things that don't need to go in those directions. And sometimes that's scary because bad things can happen when it's like that. When people don't have to follow the rules, bad things can happen. It really depends on character and intention, good intention, goodwill. But that's not enough because you need wisdom and means and reasoning. Anyway, in the state of horror, we are suddenly made aware that the deterministic barriers have given way. That face which appears at the window, for instance. We do not at first take it as that of a man, who might push the door open and take 30 paces to where we are standing. On the contrary, it is presented motionless, though it is, on the contrary, it is presented, motionless though it is, as acting at a distance. The face outside the window is in immediate relationship with our body. This is why I said that the magical is always immediate. It's always like smack dab onto our perception, impacting our conscious agency and um, facility of practice, right? Without any kind of causal, like immediate causal impact, no physical causal impact. The face out we are living and undergoing its signification. It is with our own flesh that we constitute it, but at the same time, it imposes itself, annihilates the distance, and enters into us. Consciousness plunged into this magic world drags the body with it, inasmuch as the body is belief, and the consciousness believes in it. The behavior which gives its meaning to the emotion is no longer our behavior. It is the expression of the face and the movements of the body of the other being, which make up a synthetic whole together with the upheaval in our own organism. So he says the meaning of the behavior of the emotion is a synthesis between us and the world, even when that the world includes other people and other minds. So we're really not separate. We are truly intersubjective, interpsychic phenomenologies for Sartre, thoroughly transpersonal, not just metaphysically, but also consciously. Here again, then, we find the same elements and the same structure as we were describing a little while ago, except that in the former case, the magic and the meaning of the emotion came from the world and not from ourselves. So this would be the instances where the emotion is, in fact, these would be inadequate causations. So whenever we have a passion, whenever we have an emotional action, it is our way of, I think we can maybe map this onto active and passive for, um, and in that sense, though, not so much in Spinoza. There's always a what is active for one party is passive for other parties. Um, and the active, well, the adequate causation can be uh non-reflective, but the action has to be adequate causation that is reflective. That's how I would link up Spinoza with Sartre preliminarily. But it seems that his two types of emotions he was just mentioning are the former emotions, the four types, fear, sadness, anger, and joy, and the many others, um, versus some kind of overwhelming world that takes us over and sweeps us away, where the agency is more in the world. Um, Here again, then we find the same elements and the same structure as we were describing a little while ago, except that in the former case, the magic and the meaning of the emotion came from the world and not from ourselves. Naturally, magic, as a real quality of the world, is not strictly limited to the human. It extends to things also, inasmuch as they may present themselves as human, such as the disturbing impression of a landscape, of certain objects, or of a room which retains the traces of some mysterious visitor, um, or inasmuch as they may bear the imprint of the psychic. And also, naturally, the two main types of emotion are not absolutely and strictly distinct. There we go. There are often mixtures of the two types, and the majority of our emotions are less than pure. Thus it is that the consciousness which is realizing with spontaneous finality a magical aspect of the world may create the opportunity to manifest itself as a real magical quality. And reciprocally, if the world presents itself as magical in one way or another, it may be the consciousness that specifies and achieves the constitution of this magic and is diffusing it everywhere, or on the contrary, is concentrating it forcibly upon a single magical object. In any case, it must be noted that the emotion is not the accidental modification of a subject who is surrounded by an unchanged world. It is easy to see that like this is like a Cartesian mechanism where we're just like this guy's having an emotion or that folk is having an emotion and it's all separate and it's their responsibility and it's their fault. It is their responsibility, but by golly, we are connected. We are intensely intersubjective. Is it easy to see that no emotional apprehension of an object as frightening, irritating, saddening, etc., can arise except against the background of a complete alteration of the world. For an object to appear formidable, indeed, it must be realized as an immediate and magical presence confronting the consciousness. For example, this face that I see 10 yards away behind the window must be lived as an immediate present threat to myself. But this is possible only in an act of consciousness, which destroys all the structures of the world that might dispel the magic and reduce the event to reasonable proportions. It would require, for instance, that the window as, quote, object that must first be broken, and the 10 yards as, quote, distance that must first be covered, should be annihilated in their immediacy. That's the breakdown of the deterministic world, right? These are the considerations that go out the window and everything becomes scary or wonderful and magical. This does not mean in the least that the consciousness in its terror brings the face nearer in the sense of reducing the distance between it and my body. To reduce a distance is still to be thinking in terms of distance. So similarly, although the terrified subject might think about the window, quote, it could easily be broken, or quote, it could be opened from outside, these are only rational explanations that he might offer for his fear, which was immediate in its genesis. In reality, the window and the distance are seized simultaneously in the act of consciousness, which catches sight of the face of the window. But in this very act of catching sight of it, window and distance are emptied of their necessary character as tools. They are grasped in another way. The distance is no longer grasped as distance, for it is not thought of as that which would first have to be traversed. It is grasped as the background united with the horrible. So the emotion, the magical world is puts the emotion in the world, in the background of the world. The window is no longer grasped as, quote, that which would first have to be opened. It is grasped simply as the frame of the frightful visage. And in a general way, areas form themselves around me, out of which the horrible makes itself felt. For the horrible is not possible in the deterministic world of tools. The horrible can appear only in a world which is such that all the things existing in it are magical by nature, and the only defenses against them are magical. This is what we experience often enough in the universe of dreams, where doors, locks, and walls are no protection against the threats of robbers or wild animals, for they are all grasped in one and the same act of horror. And since the act which is to disarm them is the same as that which is creating them, trying to protect yourself against the things you're dreaming, fearing, we see the assassins passing through doors and walls. We press the trigger of our revolver in vain. No shot goes off. In a word, to experience any object as horrible is to see it against the background of a world which reveals itself as already horrible. This is why it passes over to the infinite and transforms what the world is capable of. Thus, consciousness can, quote, be in the world, in Heidegger's phrase, in two different ways. The world may appear before it as an organized complex of utilizable things, such that if one wants to produce a predetermined effect, one must act upon the determinate elements of that complex. This is the deterministic world. As one does so, each tool refers one to other tools and to the totality of tools. There is no absolute action, no radical change that one can introduce immediately into this world. We have to modify one particular tool, and this by means of another, which refers in its turn to yet another, and so on to infinity. There's no like bridging the magical gap or bridging the gap with magic. But the world may also confront us at one non-utilizable whole, that is, as only modifiable without intermediation and by great masses. In that case, the categories of the world act immediately upon the consciousness. They are present to it at no distance. For example, the face that frightens us through the window acts upon us without any means. There is no need for the window to open, for a man to leap into the room, or to walk across the floor. And conversely, the consciousness tries to combat these dangers or to modify these objects at no distance and without means by some absolute massive modification of the world in emotion. This aspect of the world is an entirely coherent one. This is the magical world. Emotion may be called a sudden fall of consciousness into magic, or if you will, emotion arises when the world of the utilizable vanishes abruptly and the world of magic appears in its place. We must not therefore see in emotion a passing disorder of the organism and the mind, which enters and upsets them from outside while that environment stays static, like you said. On the contrary, it is the return, not the entry, the return of consciousness to the magical attitude, one of the great attitudes which are essential to it, with the appearance of the correlative world, the magical world. Return here makes me associate this too with the kind of raw materialism that people like Foucault and Lyotard and Kristeva talk about with infancy in the semiotic cora. The semiotic dimension of experience is felt, emotional, affective, rhythmic, and fluid. And it adumbrates all other expressions through it. So on the contrary, it is the return, like really like a return to infancy of consciousness to the magical attitude, one of the great attitudes which are essential to it, with the appearance of the correlative world, the magical world. Emotion is not an accident, it is a mode of our conscious existence, one of the ways in which consciousness understands, in Heidegger's sense of Verstehen, its being in the world. This is the last paragraph before we go to the conclusion. A reflective consciousness can always direct its attention upon emotion. In that case, emotion is seen as a structure of consciousness. It is not a pure, ineffable quality like brick red or the pure feeling of pain, as it would have to be according to James's theory. It has a meaning. It signifies something for my psychic life. But these other theories like James and Dewey and my discussion of the kind of transformation of primary perception into language in Dewey as an organization and refinement of something that's on a continuum together, um, does seem like an attempt to bring the material things into an ethereal dimension, and Dewey makes that explicit. It has a meaning. It signifies something for my psychic life, and aesthetic signification is certainly there for Dewey. The purifying reflection of phenomenological reduction enables us to perceive emotion at work, constituting the magical form of the world. I find him hateful because I am angry. Um, right? My emotions are projected. That's what we very rarely, it's more likely to be true, but very rarely see unless we have this kind of mindful understanding of emotion and phenomenology. But that reflection is rare and depends upon special motivations. In the ordinary way, the reflection that we direct towards the emotive consciousness is accessory after the fact. It may indeed recognize the consciousness qua consciousness, but only as it is motivated by the object. So instead of thinking the person interpreting the action as hateful because of a present emotion that we should be responsible for, um, I am angry because he is hateful. The that other person's interpretable, malleable, flexible action is my interpretation of it as a reflection of what I'm already going through. It is from that kind of reflection that passion is constituted, right? So like we talked about passion earlier, he really has that Spinozan definition in mind. Um, and there's consonants again. There's from Spinoza, um, Bergson, Sartre, Deleuze, and Matsumi. Those five have a through line. Sartre definitely has a through line to Bergson, and Deleuze brings Spinoza, Bergson, and Sartre explicitly together. Deleuze does a lot more. Anyway, it is from that kind of reflection that passion is constituted. Passion is whenever we are not taking responsibility for our actions and we are unable to control where they go, but that stems in part from not perceiving the intellection of causal relations. The easiest way to think about that is that if I understand how causes happen, then I can navigate them better, or I can perceive that they're happening and maybe shift slightly. Bergson thought that freedom was slight. Sartre thinks freedom is radical, and if we're willing to like commit and throw ourselves into it and find ways to uncover it. Um, and Spinoza thought that freedom was also kind of slow, but involved um, understanding that led to good choices, which was still causally constrained and deterministic, but amounted to a freedom of well-being or power. I'm sure I missed some ties there. Notes from the conclusion, emotion cannot be understood in itself without the comprehension of its signification. The whole human reality, the totality of the relations of the human reality to the world, um, the very particular laws of magic, affective human reality, and human reality is affectivity. So let's read these last 3 pages, really like 2 pages. The theory of the emotions outlined in the preceding pages was intended to serve as an experiment for the constitution of a phenomenological psychology. Naturally, its character as an example has prevented our entering upon the developments to which it should lead. From this point of view, we hope that our suggestions may lead, in particular, to the initiation of complete monographic studies. Monographs are focused, single focused texts, like a long text that's just about one thing. Complete monographic studies of joy, sadness, etc. Here we have furnished only the schematic directions of such monographs. On the other hand, since it was necessary to make a clean sweep of the ordinary psychological theories of emotion, we have had to ascend gradually from the psychological considerations of James to the idea of signification. And that was what we did with the first and I think the first and second sections were involving that. A phenomenological psychology, which was sure of itself and had already cleared the ground, would begin by first of all establishing in an eidetic reflection the essence of the psychological fact it was investigating. So once we can like assent to a first philosophy that uses eidetics, like a meditations on first philosophy, then we don't have to start in this way. This is more of a critique of the current, of like trying to persuade people to get to that position. And I think being in nothingness is that full eidetic first philosophy. That is what we have tried to do for the mental image in a work that will shortly appear. But in spite of these reservations of detail, we hope we have succeeded in showing that a psychological fact, like emotion, commonly supposed to be a lawless disorder, possesses a signification of its own, and cannot be understood in itself without the comprehension of this signification. We now wish to indicate the limitations of such a psychological investigation. Any good conclusion should recap what we've done, um, state the assumptions, the limitations, and discuss where to go next, or what you would suggest for other researchers. We said in our introduction that the significance of a fact of consciousness came to this, that it always pointed, that was a weird flash, um, that it always pointed to the whole human reality, which was making itself emotional, attentive, perceptive, willing, etc. The study of the emotions has indeed verified this principle. An emotion refers to what it signifies, and what it signifies is indeed, in effect, the totality of the relations of the human reality to the world. The onset of emotion is a complete modification of the being in the world, according to the very particular laws of magic, where we transform our being in the world from determinism into magic. But one can immediately see the limitations of such a description. The psychological theory of emotion postulates an antecedent description of affectivity so far as the latter constitutes the being of the human reality. That is, insofar as it is constitutive of our human reality to be affective human reality. If that postulate were granted, then instead of beginning with a study of emotion or of the inclinations that pointed to a human reality not yet elucidated as the ultimate term of all research, an ideal term, moreover, and very probably unattainable for those who start from the empirical, our description of the affects would proceed from the human reality described and fixed by an a priori intuition. There's another typo here that says although and then though twice. So there's 4 typos saying he instead of she for Tamara Dembo. Peripheric, ferric. I don't remember what page that's on, but it's somewhere. You could control F that, publishers. Um, and although though on page 63. And then the fourth one, it's not really an issue, but I would like some clarity on it in the introductions is that, or the forewords. The two forewords by Sebastian Gardner list two different times, uh, two different narratives about when Sartre read Heidegger's Being and Time. One of them says that he read it during 1940, during his imprisonment in 1940, but this text was published in 1939 and references Being and Time. The other forward says he read it in like the early 1930s during a different kind of era in his life. And so I just think that that could be considered and cleared up as well. Um, those are just translation, publication issues. That's not something that Sartre could change or that the argument needs to be changed, right? That's a whole other research issue, but just the copy editing has a few issues. Um, it seems like he's saying, because this a priori intuition is what phenomenology we need to start with. So it seems like he's saying that what the but one can immediately see the limitations of such a description. The psychological theory of emotion postulates an antecedent description of affectivity, so far as the latter constitutes the being of the human reality. Insofar as the description of affectivity is constitutive of our human reality to be affective human reality. So it seems like he's saying if we grant them this postulate, there's a different course of argumentation that you have to work against. And so still, he's not saying that it would result in an a priori intuition, but I think he's saying that our we're down here where he says our description of the affects would proceed. If that postulate were granted, then instead of beginning with a study of emotion or the inclinations that pointed to a human reality not yet elucidated as the ultimate term of all research, um, to work against the psychological theory, our description of the affects would proceed from the human reality described and fixed by an a priori intuition. But because it has that antecedent description of affectivity and all these descriptions behind descriptions instead of the intuition that is alinguistic and immediately given in its wholeness of truth, of understanding, um, it can't map up. And so then he pairs up this regressiveness of psychology with the progressive capacity to do that eidetic, that self-presence of phenomenology. The various disciplines of phenomenological psychology are regressive, although the ultimate term of their regression is for them purely ideal. Those of pure phenomenology, on the contrary, are progressive. It may no doubt be asked why, under these conditions, one should choose to employ the two disciplines simultaneously. Pure phenomenology might seem to suffice, but if phenomenology can prove that emotion is realization of the essence of the human reality, insofar as the latter is affectivity, Winchester. But if phenomenology can prove that emotion is realization of the essence of the human reality, insofar as the latter is affectivity, it will be impossible for it to show that the human reality must necessarily manifest itself in such emotions as it does. That there are such and such emotions and not others, this is beyond all doubt evidence of the factitious character of human existence. It is this factitiousness that necessitates a regular recourse to the empirical, and which in all probability will forever prevent the psychological regression and the phenomenological progression from complete convergence. Guys, that's it. Um, this was a long series. It took a lot of preparation. I hope it makes sense. I hope you enjoy it. I have enjoyed it. I hope if you are still confused, you go back to the beginning and do it all again. Um, I can't stand to listen to myself talk, so I probably will never listen to these. I don't even audit them. Um, but yeah, I did my best with this. It's really complicated material, but it's kind of like swift and spicy and fun and fast. And next in the class is the Les Eminence of Life. It's very short. It'll probably be like a 1 hour episode. And I'm not sure when I'll get time to record that one, but in future semesters, it'll already be done. Um, the essay question related to this will be about kind of probably I would think there are two um I would ask you to explain the structure of the text, and the first part would be about the introduction. I would want you to do probably one paragraph for each part. Um, so one paragraph about what he explains in the intro, one paragraph about uh you can do one paragraph for James and then one paragraph for Janet and then one paragraph for the Kohler school, the Gestalt psychologist that Giame references. And then you could do one paragraph for the psychoanalysis critique. And then I would leave it up to you to think about the remaining 3 or 4 paragraphs for the third section because you can't do that in one paragraph. But the dual nature of the body, thetic, non-thetic, reflective, non-reflective consciousness. Um, and the prompt will be structured like this as well. So I'll make sure that you have that. But I don't know if I'm going to keep the prompt for the Deleuze text, Eminence of Life, just because it's a really short text, and I find that students can't, there's not enough, it's just not doable. Because even though it's so short, it's really difficult uh, to unpack his ideas without all this background, versus Sartre gives you a lot of background and examples to unpack the ideas. The Eminence of Life Deleuze wrote at the end of his life, a few months before he was very sick, and um, he took his own life in an understandable at an understandable point of decline in his physical well-being. Um, yeah, so study this text. It will be your final essay, and I hope you enjoy it. Phenomenology is great. I was really skeptical of it, but I'm not after I studied Sartre. I like how Sartre does it. I don't like how Husserl does it. I think it's too transcendental. I don't like how Heidegger does it. I think it's too selfish and Nazistic, fascist. I do like how Merleau-Ponty does it, but I haven't studied that well enough, and I kind of still found it really formalistic. I don't find Sartre's Eidetics too formalistic, though being in nothingness might be too formalistic for me. Um, the formalism and proceduralism, I think his emphasis on spontaneity, though, Merleau-Ponty's great, and I'm sure there are later phenomenologists that I should read too, like my mentors. So, thank you guys again for being here. Thank you for a wonderful semester. We all have one more lecture, and I hope I did well. I hope you're prepared for a good life. Please take care. Um, Let me know if you need anything. Be well.